This Mania weekend in Dallas, join Brian Zane and special guests Alex, Queen of the Ring, Mr. Ooh La La, and Darren Corbin for a live screening and riffing of American Angels, Baptism of Blood, part of the GCW World Fair at Fair Park. For tickets and info, visit regret.brownpapertickets.com.
Hey, let's do it for the content. Mega Ran. Let's go. Let's get it. Dick Kick City. It gets gritty when Mega Ran come through. The kid gets busy. Work yourself into a shoot, but you know it's legit. Like what you like, just don't be a dick. Hey, wrestling with regret. Let's get it. Yeah. What's that set? Maybe you should bottle it. Drink it and spray it on. Get Claude to model it. 8 years in, can't look back. Who else can make the little sweatsuits look whack? Wrestling with regret. Let's get it. Yeah.
Folks, the day of this video's release is a very special one for a lot of fans out there. It's March 16th, aka 316, aka Stone Cold Steve Austin Day.
Give me a hell yeah! Hell yeah!
Oh my god, that's right, I forgot about how awful that segment was. You know what, forget that weird thing. Play something nice and badass instead. I've espoused the glory of Steve Austin for years in this channel, and for good reason. If it weren't for the Rattlesnake, wrestling as we know it today would look very different and may never have had its big cool period of the late 90s and early 2000s. Austin remains one of the most popular and endearing megastars out there. We're just now coming down off the rumor that he was going to have a match at this year's WrestleMania in Dallas. It sounds like it'll only be a talkie this year, and honestly, with the way other vets from his era have done with comebacks lately, maybe it's for the best. While Steve Austin had one of the most legendary runs ever in the biz, his period on top is all the more impressive when you consider some of the bumps in the road that happened before and after he reached his peak. And this week, I'm gonna rank him the top 8 worst Steve Austin moments of all time.
What?
I said, here are the top 8 worst Steve Austin moments of all time.
What?
I said, here are the top... damn it, you got me. You know what? Him creating that stupid chant is the unofficial number 9. Number 8, breaking up the Blondes. The history of wrestling is littered with the remains of tag teams that were broken up for no reason, and like the one you're about to see here, were split up well before their time. In early 1993, Stunning Steve Austin and Flying Brian Pillman were put in a tag team. The pairing was a shock to Austin, who was previously told he was going to be in a US title program with Harley Race as his manager. Nevertheless, the two went into it with gusto, matching their gear and their mannerisms. The two gelled almost instantly as the Hollywood Blondes and won the WCW tag team titles only a couple of months after debuting as a team. But their road to success was riddled with potholes. Their planned feud with Ricky Steamboat and Shane Douglas was derailed after Douglas was fired from the company. Then the two feuded with the newly reformed Four Horsemen, but their main event match at Clash of the Champions 23 drew the worst rating in the show's history. Then an ankle injury to Pillman forced Lord Steve Regal to fill in as he and Austin would drop the straps to Paul Roma and Arn Anderson. Now in that instance, most might have considered postponing the match to allow Bryan to heal up and get ready for the match. But unfortunately, WCW's hands were tied because due to the company's taping schedule at that time, they had already filmed weeks of TV with the Horsemen as the champions. Once Pillman came back to action, the team's breakup was inevitable. Austin began working alongside Colonel Robert Parker, who drove a wedge between the partners. But the feud never got a proper blow-off, played more for laughs, and with Pillman focusing on the manager more than the stunning one. Steve, by the way, was soon the United States champion, exactly where he was meant to be before Dusty Rhodes suddenly decided to put him in a team with Pillman. Austin believes the Blondes were broken up because they got over on their own instead of the original idea of them getting other teams over instead. That the Blondes are still regarded as one of the greatest teams in the 90s despite a relatively short shelf life speaks not only to their talent, but to a pattern of creative misfires for the Atlanta-based company. Oh, but hey, don't worry, this countdown doesn't just bash WCW's mistakes. Number 7, the Ringmaster. The mid-90s were a tumultuous time in the career of Steve Austin. Fired unceremoniously from WCW following a tricep injury, he found creative freedom in the confines of ECW. It was here that we first caught glimpses of the man who would become Stone Cold. He cut promos that were angry, cutting, and incisive, a far cry from his persona in WCW.
Because that's the way I deal with people. I'm not a very brave man, and that's the bottom line. All I've seen in ECW is a bunch of violent crap.
With a good amount of experience under his belt and a new fire lit under him, Austin was soon scooped up by the World Wrestling Federation in late '95. But instead of bringing him in as is, they took away everything that made him unique, including his name. Now known as the Ringmaster, he debuted shortly before the 1996 Royal Rumble as Ted DiBiase's hand-picked $1 million champion. Yes, they gave the guy who's almost always been good at talking someone to talk for him. Makes sense to me. Austin was certainly able to hold his own in the ring, but the character was stifling and bland. But in an era where names like Sparky Plug and Duke the Dumpster were all the rage, I suppose Steve could have had it worse than the Ringmaster. As DiBiase was jumping over to WCW, Austin was given the okay to come up with a new character based more on his personality. And soon, Stone Cold Steve Austin was born. All of us wrestling fans should be thankful that Austin got to flex his creative muscle during this pivotal time, and that he didn't go with any of the company-given names like Fang McFrost or Otto Von Ruthless. Again, he could have had it worse. Number 6. Gone in 30 Seconds. WCW in 1994 is really a tale of two different promotions. Split right down the middle is the divide between the before Hogan days and the after Hogan days. The BH era was full of great programs. Flair vs. Vader, Flair vs. Steamboat, Cactus Jack's feud with the Nasty Boys, and of course, Stunning Steve as a well-booked US champion. Then came the move to the AH era as Hulk Hogan joined up and brought many of his friends with him. Avalanche, Honky Tonk Man, and Hacksaw Jim Duggan were just a few of the first former Federation stars to make the jump, and their arrival impacted a lot of what was going on in the mid-card. In the midst of a big feud between Steve Austin and Steamboat over the US title, the Dragon suffered a back injury that spelled the end of his active career. At that year's Fall Brawl, Austin was awarded the US title, but who would replace Steamboat in that title match? Well, let's see here. Brian Pillman still around, and they didn't do a very good job wrapping that storyline up last time. What about Johnny B. Bad? He's a solid hand, or Dustin Rhodes, or the Stinger, or oh look, there's the new guy who waves the American flag all the time. He's perfect! Duggan was announced as the surprise substitute and swiftly beat Austin in roughly 30 seconds to become the new champion. While this type of blink and you miss it squash worked well for the Ultimate Warrior at SummerSlam '88, Austin was not portrayed as a fluke champion like the Honky Tonk Man. He was a tough customer who matched holds with the likes of Rhodes, Steamboat, and the Great Muta. That's right, JCW's Great Muta. Now, I'll admit, wrestling is a creative enterprise. Art is subjective and all that, but it can't be overstated just how badly Austin's trajectory was screwed up from that squash match. All it did was hammer the point home that these former Federation guys were messing things up for everyone else. But hey, who needs Austin when you got this guy, huh? Number 5. NW Oh No. When WCW was bought out by the WWF in 2001, the wrestling world rubbed its collective hands together with glee over the excitement of the possible dream matches that were coming our way. Then came the invasion. Finally, after all those big-time Warner contracts expired, the real stars of WCW started coming in. First Ric Flair, then the original version of the New World Order, Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash. Now with WrestleMania 18 just around the corner, what could have been a bigger match than Steve Austin versus Hulk Hogan, two of the biggest stars in wrestling who each took that company to new heights? As we all know, the match never happened, and depending on who you talk to, there are several reasons for that. Hogan theorized that Austin might have resented him from the WCW days, while Austin has suggested that he simply didn't think the match would have been good enough, especially as he got closer to in-ring retirement. Instead, the Hogan match went to The Rock, and the rest is history. Meanwhile, Austin was put in a lower-tier program with Hall and Nash, basically feuding with the two of them at once, because you never knew if Nash would have to pinch hit for the bad guy at WrestleMania, if you get my drift. By this point, Austin's confidence was shaken as he was recovering from an ill-fated heel turn. This combined with his well-known insecurities regarding his position on the card, and this angle was sabotaged from the start. After the NWO cost Austin his shot at the championship at No Way Out, Austin ran roughshod on the group, shooting a net at them, kidnapping Hall, and almost single-handedly killing the NWO's heat. The kidnapping scene was made even worse when Austin taunted Hall with beer and even had him laying in a pool of it by the end of the night. That could have ended poorly since Hall was taking the drug Antabuse at the time, which is designed to make the patient violently ill if they consume any alcohol. Great workplace environment, guys. Apparently the original plan was for Hall to go over Austin to balance out The Rock beating Hogan, but after Scott allegedly showed up to Mania hungover, Austin demanded that he win instead. And let's just say that in all the history of Austin's matches at WrestleMania, this was one of them. I mean, I just watched it back for this video and I still can't tell you what happened in it. The only thing anyone remembers about it is Hall's spectacular sell of the Stunner, ranking right up there with guys like The Rock and Santino Marella. In 1 month, 2/3 of the NWO looked like chumps, and the remaining third was about to turn babyface and new to the group altogether. But don't worry, the program didn't exactly do wonders for the Rattlesnake's career either. Then in less than 3 months, Austin and Hall were both gone from the company. Number 4. Pillmans Got a Gun. You know that story from WrestleMania 17 about the hardcore triple threat match? That moment backstage where the golf cart starts and immediately crashes into some cables, and it turns out they were within like inches of knocking out the entire pay-per-view feed? Well, this case of Crash TV almost got the plug pulled on Raw, which may have changed the course of wrestling history. By 1996, Vince McMahon was getting desperate in the Monday Night War. An earlier tactic of making fun of Ted Turner and his own former talent failed to move the needle. The Ultimate Warrior's return was a bust. Razor Ramon and Diesel were recast for goodness knows what reason, but up ahead in the distance were some great WCW cast-offs to shake things up, from Mick Foley to Mark Marrow to Brian Pillman and of course Stone Cold. Pillman's debut was hampered by an ankle injury from his infamous Hummer accident. Luckily, his mouth still worked, so he became a valuable piece of the puzzle in Austin's storyline with Bret Hart. But the ankle hit a snag when Bryan's ankle hadn't healed correctly, forcing another surgery to restart the healing process. The loose cannon was written off TV in iconic fashion when Austin jumped on a steel chair wrapped around Bryan's ankle, a method that has since been immortalized as Pillmanizing. The very next week, Raw was host to one of its most controversial moments ever. Kevin Kelly reported live from Pillman's home in suburban Cincinnati. Stone Cold had threatened to show up, and so instead of, calling the police, the WWF did nothing and kept the cameras rolling. What's the worst that could happen?
Because when Austin 316 meets Pillman,
oh my God.
9mm clock.
Austin showed up, beat the hell out of Pillman's friends. By the way, why was there a kiddie pool out in November? Broke into Pillman's home, shots were fired, then the moment finally ended on that wild look in Pillman's face before the screen cut to black. I can only imagine what it must have been like as a viewer to witness this for the very first time as it was happening with no power of hindsight. For a product that was still relatively miles away from the official Attitude Era, this kind of content must have been a shock to see. The stunt may have been memorable, but it failed everywhere else it counted. Nitro trounced Raw in the ratings that week, and it didn't do much to help promote Austin's match with Bret at Survivor Series a few weeks later. The USA Network was pissed, viewers complained, and even advertisers voiced their displeasure. And here's the real irony of the situation. You know what the network really got mad at the company for? Not the depiction of gun violence, but because Pillman made us swear.
All right.
Apparently, some network execs even wanted Raw canceled over the naughty language. Vince agreed to tone down the edgy content for like a minute before he ramped it up again, only this time leaving deadly weapons out of the equation. This moment might have gone over better a few years later when they were more or less untouchable, but at the time, this wild moment put a bad taste in some people's mouths and even put Raw's fate in jeopardy. Number 3. Austin gets the F out. As Austin himself has often said, the spring of 2002 was not good for him physically or mentally. His body was breaking down, his place in the company hierarchy diminished to the point where he was the number 3 babyface behind Triple H and Hulk Hogan. He was just starting a feud with Ric Flair and the returning Eddie Guerrero, which sounded cool on paper, but before that could get started, the King of the Ring had come back. Always fun to see the future stars of the company get a little bit of extra exposure with a tournament like this, so what promising young talent will we see in this first round? Ooh, Brock Lesnar versus, Stone Cold Steve Austin? The guy who won the tournament 6 years earlier, went on to win multiple world championships, and was even briefly a kayfabe CEO at one point? That's Steve Austin? Okay. Unsurprisingly, Austin didn't care much for that piece of business and skipped out on that episode of Raw, then again a week later. This after previously peacing out without notice after WrestleMania and publicly trashing the company's creative on their online show Bite This was the final straw. McMahon and the rest of the company spent loads of time burying the Rattlesnake, using the now classic line of taking his ball and going home. The timing of Austin's walkout happened to coincide with the company's rebranding to WWE, which made for a perfect reference by The Rock.
Then just like the slogan says, you get the F out. Oh, man!
This is one of those times where both sides are a little bit right and a little bit wrong. Austin was totally right to voice his displeasure over the booking of that Lesnar match, given there was zero build and zero significance given to the moment. But him publicly bashing the company and up and no-showing events full of fans, many of whom probably came just to see him, weren't great moves, even if he was justified. With so many internal and external forces working against him, the walkout may have been the best thing for him at the time, but in that moment it put a huge damper on his career. But as has been proven time and again, time and money heals all wounds with Vinnie Mac. Eventually they patched things up, and Austin came back the following February to get ready for a final match with The Rock at Mania 19. Number 2. Owen 316. I mean, there isn't much new to say about it. You've seen the story 1,000 times. SummerSlam 97, Intercontinental title match against Owen Hart. Austin's star was on the rise, but then a botched piledriver by Hart led to a broken neck and temporary paralysis for Stone Cold. Not only did he survive, he somehow managed to move his body enough to finish the match. I will never complain about how bad that roll-up looked. The fact that he was able to move at all is awe-inspiring. Obviously, the moments become part of Austin's legend, his mythos, the fact that he came back from this career-threatening injury to become the biggest draw in wrestling history, etc., etc. But in the long run, this incident had several detrimental effects to both Austin and Owen. Stone Cold adjusted his style, but did eventually have to get surgery, which put him out of action for a year. This only bought him about 18 months of in-ring time before his active career wrapped up in 2003. Meanwhile, Austin's refusal to work with Owen ever again, aside from Survivor Series 97, led to him being permanently slotted in the mid-card for the rest of his career before his tragic death at Over the Edge 99. Both Austin and Owen could and should have had careers that went at least into the late 2000s, but the consequences of one botched piledriver inadvertently led to long-term disaster for both. And my pick for the number 1 worst Stone Cold Steve Austin moment is the heel turn. Look, I know, it's cliche to talk about the heel turn at this point. Everyone's done it, it's been beaten to death, it's 21 years past now. The heel turn is legally old enough to drink a Steve Weiser. But here's the thing, if it wasn't that bad, would we still be talking about it? Upon his return to competition following neck surgery, Austin himself pitched the idea of turning heel at WrestleMania 17 in Houston, Texas. It makes sense on one level, as the character Austin originally pictured never really came to fruition once fans started cheering for him, but this would be a chance to get a different, more ruthless Rattlesnake that was envisioned. The turn took place on April 1st, 2001, but it was no joke. After bludgeoning The Rock with a steel chair to win the match and regain the WWF Championship, Stone Cold did the unthinkable and joined forces with Vince McMahon. Now, on the one hand, you could justify the turn in kayfabe as the actions of an increasingly desperate man, and maybe his wife Deborah was originally planned to have something to do with the heel turn and then it was scrapped. But the biggest problem with this turn is, actually, you know what? It's hard to boil it down to a singular problem, so let's just rattle off a few. First of all, look at that image, okay? Austin shaking hands with the guy he'd been feuding with on and off for the last 3 years after, like, everything. I would have been more open to the heel turn if Vince wasn't involved, because simply put, they were on polar opposite ends of the wrestling morality spectrum. It'd be like if Hulk Hogan and Bobby Heenan shook hands in the 80s. We'd see Austin do the same stuff with Triple H later that week. Hey, isn't that the guy who tried to have him killed not too long ago? Another issue with the turn, it happened at the biggest show of the year in Austin's home state. Talk about an absolute mind melt for the audience who thought they were going to go home happy. These folks didn't want to see their hero go bad. Nobody did, save for the man himself, it seems. Ultimately, I maintain the worst part about this heel turn was its timing in relation to The Rock's departure. Rocky leaving for much of the year to become a crappy CGI Scorpion, coupled with the looming WCW storyline, put Stone Cold and the rest of the company in a really dire situation, and not a ton of top faces loaded in the chamber. At the Invasion pay-per-view, Austin went from heel to face to heel again as he became the leader of the Alliance, which included the same company that fired him way back in 1995 and set the entire Austin character as we knew it in motion. But in an ironic twist, it was here where Stone Cold finally found his footing as a baddie. His transformation from a vicious killer into this weird, paranoid psycho was something to behold. He played off everyone in a very entertaining way, able to jump back and forth between serious and comedic behavior with ease. By the end, he was barely a heel anymore as fans grew tired of the experiment and just started cheering for him again. Again, I'm not saying a heel Steve Austin would never have worked, and there were some redeeming qualities there in that run, but they in no way outweigh the damage done. It's impossible to precisely quantify, but the heel turn most definitely led to fans tuning out from the product at the worst possible time for the Federation. The Owen Hart piledriver is obviously the worst real-life thing to happen to Stone Cold, but as I mentioned, he was able to recover and use that setback as part of his hero's journey. The turn at WrestleMania was the worst booking decision because it was poorly timed, was partially snake-bit, and dealt a serious blow to Austin's overall legacy as his career was beginning to wind down. It was a tough call, but that's why I ranked the 2001 heel turn as the worst Steve Austin moment of all time. Did I miss anything else? Open a can of whoop ass in the comment section below. But in all seriousness, happy 316 day everyone. Crack open a cold one and beat up your boss in celebration. I'm Brian Zane and... Hang on a second.
I blew out my flip-flop, stepped on a pop-top, cut my heel, had to cruise on back home. But there's booze in the blender, and soon it will render. That frozen concoction, it helps me hang on.
Wasted away.